Good morning and welcome, everyone, to the Institute for Work and Health speaker series. My name is Monique Gignac. I'm a scientific director and a senior scientist at the Institute. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'll just run through a few housekeeping bits of information for you. If you would like to activate the closed captioning, you can go to the bottom of your screen under the More icon, and you'll find closed captioning there. I will let you know right up front that we will be sharing the slides and an audio recording of the presentation probably in about a week. In terms of the way we'll run the presentation today, I will introduce our speaker, who will then give his presentation. We really welcome your questions, your comments, and any discussion. And we'd like you to type your questions into the question and answer box, please. So we won't be using the chat today. Please put your questions in the question and answer box. We often get a number of questions, sometimes quite similar questions. So if that happens, I may group the questions and ask them together so that we can try and answer as many questions as we can. If I don't get to your question today, my apologies, but please do reach out to Dr. Jetha, who'd be happy to answer anything that you have in the way of questions or address any comments that you have. Okay, so let me begin and start by saying how delighted I am to have our speaker here today. Dr. Arif Jetha is Associate Scientific Director and a scientist at the Institute for Work and Health. He's also an Associate Professor at the University of Toronto School of Public Health. His program of research aims at understanding how sociopolitical, technological, environmental, and economic changes that characterize the future of work affect the health and employment participation of vulnerable workers, including young workers and persons living with disabilities. He's currently director and principal investigator of the Partnership on AI and the Quality of Work, PAIQ or PAIQ, which is a 7-year partnership project which is newly funded to study artificial intelligence, job quality, and worker well-being. Welcome, Arif, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Monique, and good morning to everyone online. And thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to be presenting on some of this work. Obviously, been a lot of attention directed to the rapid adoption and use of different AI tools within Canadian workplaces. There actually remains less research examining how AI might create advantages or disadvantages for different groups of workers through a work and health lens. And so today I'm going to be presenting on published and in progress research, which sheds light on the worker and occupational groups most likely to be affected by AI to kind of start this conversation. And through this research, I aim to unpack potential inequities that might emerge as the technology continues to be adopted within our working world. So really excited about this work and really excited to kind of have a discussion with folks online about some of the implications of this really powerful technology. I'd like to acknowledge funding support for this research through several funding bodies, and this was critical in advancing the analytical work that we'll be discussing today. I'd also like to acknowledge our research and partnership team. Most notably, I wanted to acknowledge Ching Lau, who did a ton of heavy analytical lifting and really was the engine behind a lot of the work that I'll be presenting on today. And I also want to highlight that this work is part of a newly funded 7-year grant, which Monique discussed very briefly in her introduction. And that's entitled The Partnership on AI and the Quality of Work. And this project firmly establishes the Institute for Work and Health as a leader in developing evidence on the health and equity implications of AI in the working population. And I believe our speaker series group will provide you with a link to this project in the chat. And the project, which we call PAIQ, emerges from a research agenda on AI, work, and health that was established in 2022. And this work has been published, and the link to this article will also be in your chat function as well. So you can access that article and read it free of charge. So to begin this presentation, I thought I'd set the stage on the impact of AI at work and what we currently know about how AI is shaping our working lives. And I'll do this at a very high level, uh, given the amount of time we have together. So let's start by briefly defining AI, which I think is important. AI is an umbrella term. It broadly refers to the use of computing machines to solve problems traditionally requiring human intelligence. And if we kind of look within this umbrella, we see the term machine learning. And this is a subset of AI. It involves using statistical algorithms to find patterns in structured or unstructured data. And the ultimate goal is to make predictions. Examples of machine learning applications within our working world include fraud detection services in finance, image diagnostic tools in healthcare settings. If we kind of go further down this umbrella, we see the concept deep learning, and this is a subfield of machine learning. It uses neural networks, which are algorithms structured like the human brain, and these neural networks stimulate more complex decision makings. And what we know is that innovations in deep learning, including the use of large language models, have been at the forefront of machines being able to match or surpass humans in performing certain types of tasks, including those involving generative outputs. And examples of really complex deep learning applications within our working world include very sophisticated chatbots, which can respond to customers in a kind of a sales and service setting, content writing tools that can occur in journalism settings, as well as product defect inspection tools in the manufacturing setting, which can look at different products being produced on a manufacturing line and identify those that might have minor defects and might require them being removed from circulation. So these are just a few examples that kind of fit within these definitional uh, terminologies of AI. And a number of studies have sought to understand the extent to which AI is used within Canadian workplaces. And these estimates are often mixed. They provided kind of a mixed bag of findings. And so one statistic produced by Stats Canada shows that about 12% of companies report using AI to produce goods or services. Some surveys show that close to two-thirds of workers may be using the technology. And these findings suggest that while the technology may not be formally adopted by an organization, workers are still turning to AI to support their work. Other estimates indicate high levels of financial investment in AI solutions among Canadian workplaces. In addition, we're seeing the federal government direct a lot of resources towards a national AI strategy. So overall, AI is playing an increasingly prominent role at work, and I don't think this trend will change over time. I think we're only going to see kind of an increased role within our working lives. Growing studies have also sought to examine the ways in which AI can impact our working lives, and a synthesis of this literature highlights several critical themes that I think are important to introduce to kind of provide a background for this presentation. First and most prominently, AI can be used to augment job tasks or enhance the work performed by human workers across a broad range of occupations, including those with physical or more cognitive demands. Most research suggests that AI in its current state is unable to fully automate our jobs. So I think our fears of AI taking over our working lives, I think, is a little overblown. But at the same time, AI may be used to automate specific job tasks, to optimize outputs while also freeing up time for human workers to perform high value tasks. And it's through this lens that many believe that AI might contribute to significant productivity gains for human workers. That said, research has consistently shown that the technology may substantially redistribute and reorganize work activities between humans and machines in ways that represent potentially significant changes to the way we work and our conditions at work. And so a critical priority of our research on AI at the Institute is to apply a health and equity lens, offering a unique perspective that complements those studying the productivity benefits of the technology. And so to do this, we can utilize a social determinants of health framework that can be depicted in this model recently published by colleagues at the Institute in the journal The Lancet. According to this model, employment and working conditions can directly and indirectly impact the health, safety, and well-being of workers through several critical pathways. Relatedly, the social position of a worker, like their gender, their age, their immigration status can be connected to the type of work a person may obtain and their conditions at work, which relate to their health. The relationship between employment conditions and health is illustrated really well in a study conducted by my colleague Faraz Vahid Shahidi, where he recently characterized Canadian occupations according to their quality. And what he found was that workers in occupations that are of lowest quality and are most precarious, such as those that are characterized by a lack of stability, security, or adequate wages, face the highest rates of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, and cancer when compared to those in better quality jobs. As noted, employment and the working conditions that impact health may be patterned according to social position. In this presentation, specifically on AI, we're going to focus on gender differences, but I want to acknowledge that other personal factors maybe relate to the benefits and harms of AI at work. As illustrated in this chart based on Canada's Labour Force Survey, we see that the labor market is gendered, with men and women often clustering into specific occupations. And this clustering may be associated with disparities between women and men with regards to pay and other dimensions of job quality. This gendered clustering of occupations may also be associated with the differential impacts of technology when comparing women and men. And past studies have found that women workers have been less likely to work in occupations that have benefited from the adoption of new technologies. Women are also less likely to utilize new technologies within their work. Fewer studies to date have examined gender differences related to AI at work, so kind of highlights a specific knowledge gap that we ought to consider. And so turning back to our social determinants of health framework, AI may represent a driving force that alters the relationship between work and health for different groups of workers. Yet, if we look to the research, very few scholars have sought to examine how AI may impact longstanding labor market disparities or shape the health, safety, and well-being of workers. And so through the research at IWH, we're building an evidence base to address this critical knowledge gap. And the research that I present on today provides a small piece to this larger puzzle that we're currently pursuing. And so that takes me to the aims and objectives of today's presentation. And so the overall aim is to examine how AI impacts Canadian workers and occupations. Specific objectives include to explore the role of measures of occupational AI exposure as a proxy to determine AI impact in the labor market. The second objective of this presentation is to examine the differential impact of AI according to worker and occupational characteristics. In particular, in this study, we're going to focus in on gender as a worker characteristic and precarious work, an occupational characteristic. And very lastly, the last objective of this presentation is to draw from the social determinants of health framework to identify and interpret findings. So to address study aims and objectives, I'm going to present a summary of findings from 2 studies of Canadian workers. Before I do that, I'm going to briefly describe our analytical approach that informed both studies. And so we utilized established measures of occupational AI exposure designed by economists to address our study objectives. It's important to acknowledge that there are actually a number of AI exposure measures that exist, each with strengths and weaknesses. I've chosen 2 measures that focus on the impact of specific AI subtypes. The first is the suitability of machine learning measure. The second is a recently published large language model measure that looks at the role of large language models within different occupations. And as I progress through this presentation, I'll describe both measures in greater depth. But one thing I do want to highlight is that both measures that were utilized have actually emerged from an economic perspective that views occupations as a bundle of multiple job tasks and work activities. Through this perspective, economists have studied how different technologies impact specific job tasks rather than entire occupations. This perspective also aligns with a classification of occupations that have been comprehensively captured in the US ONET database accessed by our team. And so ONET breaks down over 1,000 occupations according to a set of standardized job tasks and work activities. The breakdown of these job tasks have allowed economists to study how AI might be able to perform different job tasks to which occupations are composed, thus informing the 2 exposure measures that we utilized. And so in this slide, I provide two specific examples of occupations, one being internal medicine physicians and the second being construction laborers, and a handful of corresponding job tasks that have been classified according to ONET. And this is just a bit of a sampling of the way that ONET looks and operates. The data source for the two studies I present on today is Canada's Labour Force Survey, which is a nationally representative survey. It's conducted as a cross-sectional monthly survey of the household population. It's composed of about 100,000 respondents and is built using probability sampling to provide us with a national picture. What's important to note is that the classification of occupations in the ONET database that I introduced earlier that have been designed in the United States can be mapped onto Canadian National Occupational Codes by our team. And this allows us to look at how occupational impact of AI can be visualized within a Canadian context. And this kind of mapping occurs based on matching attributes between the occupational codes. And so now that I've presented on our overarching analytical approach, I'm going to present on some key findings from both studies. Starting with study one, our team sought to examine worker differences in occupational exposure to machine learning. And findings from the study are published in the journal Social Science and Medicine. So you can access this, it's open access, and I believe a link to the article will appear in your chat. And for the study, we utilized the suitability for machine learning measure. The developers of the measure created a rubric which was applied to the ONET database to evaluate the likelihood of machine learning to perform a job task. Based on the evaluation of different job tasks using the rubric, an occupation level suitability for machine learning score was produced. Through the application of the measure to the Canadian Labour Force Survey, our team categorized occupations into three groups based on their suitability for machine learning value. In this slide, I'm presenting a snapshot of occupations with the highest and lowest suitability for machine learning value to provide you with some tangible examples regarding how different jobs were categorized. As you may notice, occupations that are in the high category of machine learning exposure are white collar and middle skill types of jobs where they may be required to process data and make simple predictions. So an example of that could be a travel agent. Occupations with low machine learning exposure may be those characterized by physical and unpredictable job tasks. So an example of that could be a police officer. Next, we analyzed gender differences according to occupations with high, medium, and low machine learning exposure. We found that at a crude level, Canadian women workers were more likely to work in an occupation with high machine learning exposure. In contrast, we found that men were more likely to be employed in an occupation with low machine learning exposure. So that's an interesting trend and one that's notable. But for both men and women workers, we want to further examine the relationship between machine learning exposure and different worker characteristics, including levels of education and hourly wages. We conducted multinomial logistic regression models stratified by gender to compare the factors associated with machine learning exposure while adjusting for different worker and work context factors. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm only going to provide a snapshot of findings highlighting some of these notable gender differences. So in the following slides, I'm going to show you several graphs. And before I do, I want to provide you with a brief orientation to help you interpret the findings. So as you can see on both sides of this screen, you'll see two graphs and they include yellow dots. And these yellow dots represent odds ratios from the multinomial models. And the lines represent confidence intervals. An odds ratio over 1 indicates a greater odds or likelihood in the association between a factor and the outcome. So in this case, the outcome is machine learning exposure. An odds ratio less than 1 indicates a lower odds or likelihood in the association between a factor and the outcome. You'll notice that the odds ratios are presented based on a comparison of the three levels of machine learning exposure: high, medium, and low. So with that, our first set of models, we examined the relationship between educational attainment and occupational machine learning exposure for men and women. In these graphs, we focus specifically on comparing workers with the highest levels of educational attainment, so those with a university degree above a bachelor's degree, to workers with the lowest educational attainment, so those receiving less than a post-secondary education. Interestingly, In contrast to the descriptive findings presented in the earlier slides, our models showed that women with the highest educational attainment actually had the lower odds of being in an occupation that is highly exposed to machine learning, and that's the graph to the left. Whereas if we look to the right side of the screen, we see that men with the highest levels of education had the highest odds of being in an occupation that is highly exposed to machine learning. So the relationship kind of flips when we start looking at educational attainment by gender. Next, we compared women and men according to the relationship between hourly wages and occupational machine learning exposure. And I'm going to focus specifically on the highest earners and compare them to the lowest earners. Referring to the left side of the screen, our models showed that the highest earning women had the lowest odds of being in an occupation that is highly exposed to machine learning. In comparison, the highest earning men on the right side of the screen had the highest odds of being in an occupation that is highly exposed to machine learning. So the snapshot of findings from the study provides an important signal. The impact of machine learning on workers is not uniform. Specifically, our research shows some notable gender differences. And broadly speaking, Canadian women workers are employed in jobs that are highly exposed to machine learning. However, our models show that this gender pattern is a little bit more nuanced. When we looked at the highest earners and those with more education, reflecting workers probably in better jobs, men workers face the highest occupational machine learning exposure when compared to women. And so it's important to acknowledge that from our analytical approach, we can't actually determine whether greater machine learning exposure is advantageous or disadvantageous. But drawing from past research on gender differences in terms of technological benefits and use at work, we can hypothesize that the highly paid and educated women workers may be excluded from machine learning related economic opportunities and productivity gains when compared to men, which could reinforce or widen existing gender divides. And so to test this hypothesis, we suggest that more research is needed to kind of unpack this gender differences or these gender patterns that we're identifying in the data. So now we'll turn to study 2. And in the second study I present on today, our team examined how occupational characteristics may be associated with AI impacts. Our team focused specifically on the relationship between large language model exposure and precarious work in the second study. I want to highlight that findings are unpublished and preliminary, but I think they provide an interesting picture into the storyline between large language models and how they might be impacting our labor market. Our second study utilized a newly published measure to examine occupational exposure to large language models. The designers of this measure created a rubric applied to the US ONET database to examine the extent to which large language models could reduce the time required for a human to complete a job task while preserving or improving job task quality. An aggregate score was produced reflecting the extent to which an occupation's job task can be performed by a large language model. When applied to the Canadian Labour Force Survey data, we scored all occupations according to large language model exposure utilizing this measure. Similar to the previous analysis of occupational machine learning exposure in the study that I previously presented on, here we found that occupations with physical and unpredictable job demands had the lowest large language model exposure values. In contrast, occupations centered on language, information, synthesis, documentation, communication, and rule-based cognitive problem solving received the highest large language model exposure values. And so in comparison to the machine learning study that I talked about earlier, there's maybe a different kind of suite of jobs that are being affected by this new form of AI. As part of study 2, we wanted to look at occupational characteristics that may be associated with large language model exposure. And we focused specifically on precarious work. To measure precarious work, we accessed items that are routinely collected in Canada's Labour Force Survey, including temporary employment, low wages, irregular work hours, and involuntary part-time work. And we used an approach designed by colleagues at the Institute for Work and Health. And here, each precarious work item was assigned to was used to group Canadian occupations into 4 quartiles of exposure. And the first quartile representing occupations with the lowest prevalence of exposure to precarious work. and the fourth quartile representing occupations with the highest prevalence of exposure to the precarious work item. A multidimensional precarious work index was then created based on the number of times an occupation was assigned to the fourth quartile across the various items. Using the index, more times that an occupation is assigned to the fourth quartile indicates an occupation with which there's a higher likelihood of exposure to precarious work. Through our analysis, we identified a consistent relationship between precarious work and occupational large language model exposure. Let's start by looking at the individual precarious work items. First, we examined the prevalence of exposure to temporary employment. As shown on this graph, occupations with the lowest prevalence of temporary employment had the highest exposure to large language models. In comparison, occupations characterized by the highest prevalence of temporary employment had the lowest exposure to large language models. Second, we examined the association between low-wage work and large language model exposures. We found that occupations with the lowest prevalence of low wages had the highest exposure to large language models. On the other hand, occupations with the highest prevalence of low wages had the lowest exposure to large language models. Third, we see a similar inverse relationship with irregular work hours and its relationship to large language model exposures. Occupations with the lowest prevalence of irregular work hours had the highest exposure to large language models. The opposite was true for occupations with the highest prevalence of irregular work hours. And very lastly, we examined the relationship between involuntary part-time work and occupational large language model exposure. Occupations with the lowest prevalence of involuntary part-time work had the highest exposure to large language models. In comparison, occupations with the highest prevalence of involuntary work had the lowest exposure to large language models. So as you can see, there's a pattern forming. Finally, we estimated mean occupational large language model values using a multivariable linear regression model. In particular, the linear regression model examined the relationship between different levels of the multidimensional precarious work index and occupational large language model exposure, which was treated as a continuous variable. Also, the model allowed us to produce estimates which adjusted for worker and occupational characteristics. In this graph, the yellow dots represent the mean occupational large language model exposure values, and the lines represent confidence intervals. We found that occupations characterized by low precarious work, where no precarious work items were assigned the highest prevalence of exposure, had the highest large language model exposure value. In comparison, occupations with medium, high, and very high precarious work had lower large language model exposure values. And you'll see as in this chart that the high, medium, and very high precarious work groups were actually quite clustered together. So there was no differentiation between those groups. So in this second study, we showed that occupations characterized by higher quality and less precariousness are those where large language models can play a more significant role. Findings may suggest that these types of jobs may require workers to perform straightforward, cognitive, communication, analytical, or reasoning types of job tasks most suitable to being performed or completed by a large language model system. Interestingly, occupations characterized by greater quality have previously been insulated from automation or technological adoption, and results could reflect that as AI advances, it has the potential to impact a different portfolio of occupations when compared to past technological changes. Again, our findings can't tell us if greater exposure to large language models may be advantageous or disadvantageous, but we can offer some potential interpretations of our findings. We may hypothesize that being more exposed to large language models could create productivity benefits that could be accessible to workers in the best quality jobs and less present for those working precariously. It may also be that over time, exposure to large language models within these jobs could reduce the demand for workers and contribute to greater precarity in occupations that have historically been of high quality. Of course, back to this kind of same message that we need additional research to test these hypotheses and to unpack these findings in greater depth. So that takes us to some kind of key takeaway points. What can we kind of can extract from this data that I presented on today? Because there was quite a bit that I threw at everyone. So I think there's growing agreement that AI will have a transformative impact on work, and we need to understand how this is impacting our working lives and different groups of workers. And from these two studies I presented on today, our team showed that occupational AI exposure measures can be a valuable proxy regarding how AI may influence the labor market. Importantly, using these measures, our studies show that the impact of different forms of AI on the labor market will not be uniform. As an example, we bring to light the differential impact of AI according to gender and precarious work. As mentioned earlier, we aren't able to determine whether greater exposure to AI can be harmful or beneficial. AI may have the potential to create new obstacles for workers who have previously been marginalized, such as women, or those who are in working situations that have tended to be disadvantageous, like those working precariously. Alternatively, AI could also improve the working lives of those who previously faced exclusion, minimizing inequities by offering a productivity tool. It's my view that these findings that we presented today offer a starting point for additional research. Primary research is required to help us understand how AI might actually impact workers and those working in different occupations. Future research on groups of workers from different social positions or facing different employment and working conditions may also be beneficial to further examine the impact of AI. Research is also required to examine the implications of being in a job where exposure to AI is minimal, and there is a potential to be excluded from AI-related productivity gains. So that exclusion of the technology is also an area that we ought to be looking at. And so drawing from the social determinants of health framework that I introduced at the start of this presentation, our findings may signal that AI could disrupt our understanding of the relationship between work and health. And that this disruption is not going to be consistent across the labor market or may not reflect the patterns we have seen during past periods of labor market transformation. Through the research that we're leading at the Institute for Work and Health, our goal is to build on the insights presented today and significantly expand our understanding of the work and health implications of AI. Indeed, this research is necessary to build an evidence base that can be used to protect workers most affected by AI and promote greater equity in a changing labor market. So with that, I will conclude the formal part of this presentation. And I'll turn it to Monique to start the facilitation of the Q&A. And I look forward to those, to your questions, your comments, your reflections on the data that I presented on today. And I just wanted to just do a quick plug for those who want to learn more about the research that we conduct at the Institute to sign up for our quarterly, for our monthly news alerts and our quarterly newsletters. And you can use the QR code on this slide that will help you or direct you straight to sign up to receive more updates on the work that we do. So with that, over to you, Monique.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the presentation, Arif. It was very interesting, very complex, lots of work that you'll be doing, I know, in the future. Before I ask the first question, I just want to remind people that the presentation slides and audio will be available in about a week for you if you want to go back and look at some of the information. So, Arif, a number of questions have come in asking you to kind of speculate and think a little bit beyond the findings, the specific findings of your study. And so I'm going to ask you a few of those questions. One person is interested in better understanding what specific strategies can organizations implement to ensure that AI adoption in the workplace does not widen existing inequalities among workers, especially for those with less access to technological training and upskilling opportunities. Do you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think a general message that I think is important for all of us to keep in mind is that the concept of AI and the role it plays within our working lives, it's not going to go anywhere. And I think it's going to play a more prominent role. Some AI tools will be helpful and really kind of change our working lives for the positive, and some might have very minimal impacts and might not advance our working lives anymore, or might make things worse for us depending on where you stand. And so what I would answer to that person is the first step is we all ought to build AI literacy. And this can be very basic, a very basic solution. It can include just understanding what AI is, how it's developed, how the design and the implementation can create opportunities as well as barriers for different groups of workers. And I think this literacy is critical to identifying places or points in which it could create challenges for different groups. A lot of times AI literacy training programs can be free of charge. A lot of kind of not-for-profit organizations that are reputable and who are well versed in the area of AI, they're offering these types of training programs free of charge. And so I would definitely direct the person to several training programs. And if they want to email me offline, my contact information is there, and I can direct you to those programs. But I think literacy is the critical kind of first step in this process. Uh, and it'll allow us to kind of understand where things can go wrong and where things can go right.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and a second question I think has some overlap, but not entirely so, in terms of employees' preparedness. And so the individual is noting, of course, that there can be advantages as well as disruptions for employees, and that recent discussions featuring prominent AI experts have highlighted their concerns about the possible displacement of a substantial portion of jobs within the next 5 to 10 years. So from your perspective, what is the anticipated impact of AI on employees' health and safety, on job stability, and on industrial relations?
Yeah, so we think about this a lot within the partnership that I introduced at the start of this presentation. It's a big focal point, and they've been talking about robots, AI taking our jobs for the last decade. And while that can be the case in certain occupations, I think the widespread fears are a little bit overblown. And the data shows this, that in fact, there hasn't been mass displacement from the adoption of AI in our working world. So I think that's critical to highlight that it hasn't happened yet. It's not to say it won't happen down the line, but it just hasn't happened yet. And what all the data suggest is that if AI is utilized within our working lives, it can actually produce productivity benefits that can be quite helpful for different groups of workers. And to bring this to life, a good example is in the field of healthcare, where AI is utilized quite a bit, especially in diagnostics. So to screen for cancer or to screen for different health issues, utilizing different like utilizing imaging that can be produced through a CT scan or MRI. And a lot of speculation about 10 years ago was that certain health professionals like radiologists would be displaced because these tools were so powerful. And what the data actually shows is because the tool has made radiologists' working lives more productive, there's been an increased demand for this subspecialty of physicians. And so I think this trend has kind of shown itself in a number of different fields where folks who are able to understand how to best utilize the technology and utilize it to their advantage are able to see benefits and are able to kind of leverage it to be better workers. And I think that should be a theme that we all ought to be thinking about is how can we utilize the tool to create a competitive advantage. I do want to highlight that the opportunities to utilize technology to our advantage might be one that is an inequitable one. So we know that not all groups of workers have equal access to training and technology and are working in jobs where they can have a say over how the technology is utilized. And so this kind of picture that AI is going to make things more productive might not be consistent across the labor market. And that's one of the key themes that emerged from this data, is that the way that it's impacting different worker groups is not uniform. We're all not going to benefit from the technologies and from the productivity benefits. And I think we ought to start researching like who's going to be disadvantaged and how this disadvantage is playing out.
Okay, and so we have a lot of questions here. I'm going to try and get through as many as I can, but I want to pick up on that because we have a couple of questions. Can you speak a little bit more about this issue in terms of workers, for example, with physical disabilities who are often already employed in precarious occupations? And also, second, and I can repeat it if you forget, Did you look at AI by age group? So younger workers entering the workforce compared to workers who are older, middle-aged, or and maybe looking to be leaving work. But let's start first with the physical disabilities, and that these folks are already often in precarious work.
Yeah, so as you likely saw from the data, we didn't focus on disability in this specific research study. Um, but I think the reflection from the person who's asking the question that they're more likely to work in precarious work is one that obviously is one that kind of aligns with the research that we discussed today. And what they will note here is that what we found was that those who are working more precariously were more likely to be in jobs exposed to large language models. And so, again, there's a good news story and there's a bad news story here. The good news story is perhaps persons with disabilities who previously faced substantial challenges to employment inclusion may actually have at their disposal tools that can make their working lives better, that may be able to kind of address some of the exclusion that they faced previously. It might just provide a tool to allow them to do their jobs more productively and with a greater efficiency. At the same time, it could mean that they're working in jobs that large language models can take over some of their job tasks and create more pressure on their precarity, or kind of just increasingly or contribute to greater precarity. And so again, we can't tell the whether or not the impact will be positive or negative, but I think there's this trend is one that we just ought to kind of look into a bit more and think about as we conduct more research and as we start to look at the impacts on different groups. Um, Monique, can you remind me of the second part of that question? It was on age.
Age, are young workers entering the workforce?
Yeah.
Have you been able to look at age differences yet? Is that something you plan to do?
Yeah, so we accounted for age in our model. So the findings, especially with regards to machine learning exposure, uh, uh, those accounted for age. We didn't look at age differences the way that we looked at gender differences, but there are a number of signals based on research that have been produced by other research groups to suggest that young and new workers are working in jobs that are being adversely affected by new AI tools and systems. And so those were studies conducted in the United States. And so it's unclear how that's playing out in Canada, but the data does suggest that young workers are affected by AI disproportionately compared to middle and older aged workers. And I think, again, this is a storyline that just requires more data or more analysis within a Canadian context. And so it's hard to provide that picture within our current landscape.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
A couple of data clarifications or methods clarifications. Someone has noted excellent presentation, and they may have missed the interpretation a little bit, but did you say that you found precarious work was associated with a higher exposure to AI work in the descriptives, but that the opposite happened when it was in adjusted regression models?
Yeah, so that analysis was with regards to the machine learning exposure, I believe, which is at when we just looked at descriptive findings, what we found was that women were more likely to work in jobs with high levels of machine learning exposure. So jobs in which machine learning would have a bigger role or were more likely to perform job tasks. But when we started to look at the findings utilizing multivariable models that were stratified according to gender, what we found was that when we looked at educational differences and wage differences, that this relationship kind of flipped, that women were less likely to work in jobs that were of low exposure, and men were more likely to work in jobs that were highly exposed to machine learning exposure. And so it just goes to show that the pattern, there's patterns according to personal factors like gender, but these patterns are more nuanced when we start looking into how these groups differ according to educational attainment, hourly wages. And this provides a picture that the characteristics of these occupations in which people are working in, they are affected by AI tools differently.
Okay, and following up on the occupations, someone is asking, can you give some examples of occupations that are in the first and the fourth quartiles of precarious work? So sort of the highest and the lowest of precarious work. Do you have some examples that come to mind?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't have specific occupational examples off the top of my head, and didn't prepare that graph for this presentation, but I'd be happy if that person sent me a note and I could link them to some more specific examples that accurately reflect what we saw in the data. So I would just encourage them to reach out over email, and I'll provide them with some specific examples.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have someone asking whether you think future AI tools can be used to improve the psychosocial environment in the workplace.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and it's part of some of the research that we're currently doing on other projects related to the partnership on AI and quality of work. And again, there's a mixed bag here. Some studies are suggesting that uh, the use of AI tools will make our jobs easier. It'll automate the most stressful aspects of our jobs. It'll free up time for the types of activities that give us the most pleasure at work, that give us the most satisfaction, that are the most human. On the other hand, there's emerging evidence to suggest that the use of AI at work increases surveillance, it increases data collection, uh, which can be a source of stress. Oftentimes, workers feel the need to keep up with really efficient and highly productive AI tools, and that could cause a stressful situation. It could cause a worker to feel that their work is more intensified. And these are themes that have emerged. There's not a strong body of evidence that I can point the person who's asking the question about that can kind of bring this to light, but it's work that we're currently pursuing, and we think it's of significant importance.
Yeah, so I'm going to follow up because you've answered part of, I think, this person's question, this
Mhm.
other person's question. But I want to just kind of put it in the context that you're raising here as well to see if you have any additional comments.
Yeah.
The person notes, we're hearing from workers that AI is being implemented to intensely monitor and discipline workers. Things like driver-facing cameras for truck drivers, AI agents listening to call center workers,
Mhm.
and that this can create greater stressors and an erosion of the quality of work. Do you have any additional comments to what you've just been saying, and information about sort of this possible dynamic? Are we going to see new legislation, for example, that curbs some of this? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so that is a theme that has emerged in the literature, and we have looked into the different aspects of AI design and adoption that can create health and safety risks, as well as kind of impact the well-being and the workers' perceptions of their work environment that are related to this kind of idea that adoption and design decisions play a role. And so again, this is an area that we're pursuing, that we're interested in quite a bit, and we've done some work in. Uh, it is certainly an area that's going to affect workers if they know that they're being constantly monitored, if their data is being constantly consumed. It's going to impact the way that they engage at the workplace, how they feel about their work, and these are important themes that to date many occupational health and safety studies have not really looked into, and I think it just kind of brings to light the absence of research that we currently have in this space. Um, and so the second question, or the second aspect of that question, was with regards to legislation. And again, this is work that we're currently looking into right now. And in Canada, there's no legislation to protect workers specifically related to AI related harms that can emerge as a result of adoption and design decisions. Um, and this is also the case kind of federally, and but there are legislation that is emerging in different contexts. For instance, in the European Union, they have an AI Act that provides some guardrails around how AI is utilized as a way to protect different groups of workers in terms of design and adoption decisions. So I think we haven't seen any sort of protections that exist in Canada yet, but I suspect that that will change over time as we start to understand the benefits and harms in greater depth.
Okay, so some interest, of course, you had some almost counterintuitive findings related to education and income. So someone is asking, does your research imply that STEM educational qualifications, so STEM, science, technology, engineering, medicine, that STEM educational qualifications may be less likely to guarantee employment in the future because complex tasks can be done better by AI?
My research does not does not point to that, and so based on that data, I can't speak to that, but I can offer some reflections that align with the data. And I think what we have seen is that with the gender patterns that have emerged with regards to machine learning exposure and at work for men and women provide some clues that can align with this person's question. And so if we look like to previous kind of technological transformations, like the automation of work or digital platforms at work, what previous data has indicated is that women have often been less likely to benefit from this technology. They're less likely to receive STEM training. They've been less likely to utilize technology to be advantageous for their work. That's consistently shown in previous technological transformations. And so what we found was that different groups of women may be more or less exposed to machine learning. And to me, that highlights kind of several interesting themes. One, is this just kind of replication of what happened in the past with certain groups of women being excluded from productivity gains that can be associated with new technologies? Or might this be a new trend where women might be buffered or might be protected against being adversely affected by AI tools? And so again, like I think STEM training plays a role in this. It's important for all of us to ensure that we have the literacy and we're able to navigate a working world where AI is increasingly prominent. But I think like with regards to the data and what we found, I don't think it provides a clear picture on how STEM training can either have a benefit or a disadvantage to our working lives. I think in general, we ought to just be better informed about how AI can be utilized to improve our working lives.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to get through a couple of other questions. Again, if I don't get to your question, my apologies. Please do reach out to Arif. You had noted that some work does not have a lot of direct exposure to AI, and an individual would like you to comment, does limited exposure to AI in a job necessarily mean low impacts for those workers? I'm thinking of precarious gig workers whose working conditions are controlled by AI, like Uber drivers facing dynamic pricing, but who may not be directly using these tools. Any comments?
Yeah, for sure. This is an important theme. So I think maybe one takeaway message that perhaps wasn't as prominent from the slides, which is that while AI, like the different AI tools that we looked at, machine learning, large language exposure, large language models, they may not be consistently affecting different occupations. There was no occupations where there was zero exposure to these AI tools, suggesting that all of us, no matter what jobs we do, have at least some job tasks where AI can be utilized to perform those job tasks. So we all have some degree of job tasks that can be performed by AI. So if we look at the example of a police officer, where a lot of their kind of day-to-day job tasks are physical, they're unpredictable, they just require a lot of more physical strain. They still have some degree of cognitive demands. For instance, they might have to do paperwork. They might have to log different aspects of their day-to-day encounters with different folks as they're doing their jobs, and that is an example of a job task that could be potentially performed by an AI tool. And so that's an important theme, that no matter what job we're in, we're all going to have some degree of exposure to an AI system. And now the person that is asking, like we might not actively be utilizing the tool, but we're affected by it. And that is a reflection of AI exposure. So the measures that we utilized, they take into account the types of activities that we do, the job tasks that we perform, and they take into account the fact that some of these decisions are decisions we make to utilize tools, whereas some of it is kind of imposed on us. And so that would be captured in our findings. And they do affect our working lives.
Okay, thank you. Another question for you. What are some of the barriers, or what maybe should be some of the barriers to quicker and more widespread AI adoption within organizations, large organizations, for example, when it comes to health and safety specific roles and functions?
Yeah, so I think it's my opinion. So again, this study wasn't specifically focused on health and safety. We do have other research that we've conducted on AI and health and safety that if the person wants to know a little bit more about that kind of portfolio of work, happy to send them some specific research that we've conducted in that area. But it's my perspective that we shouldn't be rushing into AI adoption decisions. We have to, one, understand the specific problem that we're trying to address within our working lives, whether that be health and safety, whether that be productivity, and make the decision, is AI the appropriate tool to be utilizing to improve those specific organizational outcomes? Uh, and then we have to be more aware of how the decisions we make in terms of how the tools are designed and how they're adopted, how that could affect the health, safety, and well-being of the kind of the workers that are exposed to those tools. And I think what's interesting about this kind of phenomenon or this transformation is that a lot of these tools are often developed by third-party vendors like big technology companies or uh, technology developers who are creating these tools outside of the work environment in which they're adopted. And that can create specific challenges. So it's important to kind of understand the decisions that are made and how the tools should be adopted to better understand who can be benefited and who might be disadvantaged from a health and safety perspective.
So if you were to sum up some of the perhaps ethical implications that AI has in a workplace for workers or workplaces who are thinking about this, what are the kinds of ethical implications that you would highlight?
Well, I guess I'm not an ethicist, so I guess it's a bit challenging for me to address that concern. But I think I would turn back to the equity lens that we kind of discussed throughout this presentation, and that equity lens tells us that not all workers will kind of obtain the same benefits and disadvantages from the adoption of AI at work. And I think through that equity lens, we have to understand that, some people might be adversely affected by the adoption of these tools, and we need to understand how to better protect those workers. And at this stage in our research program here at the Institute, as well as globally, there's not enough evidence that we can utilize to address those equity considerations. And I think to me, that's an important motivation that I have moving forward in this kind of research program, is to ensure that the evidence that we produce can directly be utilized by workers, employers, unions, policymakers, to ensure that we can protect workers, we can ensure that the harms are minimized and the benefits are amplified.
So very quickly, before we finish, what are some of your next steps? Where are you going next with some of this research?
Yeah, so we have a huge 7-year program of research on as part of the partnership on AI and quality of work. And as noted, some of the big research gaps that I highlight in this presentation, we're aiming to address through that research. We're planning on going into workplaces to observe how workers are navigating new AI tools. We're observing the changing evidence base, and we're synthesizing that evidence base. We are continuing to do these big population level studies to examine how different groups of workers are affected by new AI tools. And so I guess a key message that I would kind of put out there is stay up to date with our research program, subscribe to our e-newsletter, our e-alerts. Will continue to provide updates on how things are moving forward with this big research program.
Okay, I want to thank you very much, Arif. I want to thank everyone who attended today. I'm sorry there were a few questions left that we don't have time to get to, but please do reach out to Arif with your questions. Lots of good comments, Arif, as well about the presentation and the work that you're doing. So thank you very, very much. And of course, we'll have you back as you have more research in the future. And I want to just thank again everyone in the audience, and hope that you will return back in January when we will have another one of our speaker series presentations. This will be presented by Dr. Dwayne Van Eerd, who will be talking about understanding PTSI program implementation processes in Alberta first responder organizations. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and thank you again. Take care.